In the last lesson, we created an observable that delivered two values before completing. We then subscribed, supplying our observer object, logging the emitted values to the console. While this worked just fine, what if we don't need or care about this complete notification? Or maybe we want to handle errors outside of this error callback. The subscribe method is actually quite flexible in this regard, letting you supply any or none of the possible callbacks, as well as provide them in a few different ways. Let's take a look. The first thing we could do if we don't need one or more of these callbacks is to simply remove them from the observer object. When your observer is converted into a subscriber internally, the functions you do not supply will be ignored, or stubbed out with defaults. For instance, if we remove the error and complete properties from our observer and run this, it still works just fine. We just don't get the message logged for complete. You can do this for any combination of properties. So if we remove the error and next callbacks and save, we now just have the complete function fired. We could even supply no observer at all to the subscribe method. In this case, behind the scenes, empty functions are supplied for complete and next, and the error is thrown upward and handled internally. In general though, if I find myself invoking an empty subscribe method, it's normally a good sign that I move logic upwards into other operators where I shouldn't have. So treat this as a warning sign if you find yourself doing this very often. The second and probably more popular way to supply your observer callbacks to the subscribe method is to ignore the observer object altogether and simply pass functions. For instance, if I just want to supply the next function, instead of passing an object with just the next property, I can instead provide that function directly to the subscribe method. So let's copy and paste this function into the subscribe method. This will then be hooked up to the subscriber and invoked on next notifications. When we save, we can still see the emitted values being logged to the console by the function we provided. The same can be done for the error callback by supplying it as a second argument, and the complete callback by supplying it as the third and final argument. So let's copy and paste these down underneath the next function we provided as the first argument. And we need to clean this up a bit by removing the property name. When we run this, we can see our complete callback is now fired again. If you do not want to provide any of these functions, for instance, we want to leave the error slot blank, you can simply pass in null. When these notifications occur, your subscriber will be checked to see if these callbacks were registered. If so, they will be called appropriately, and if not, they will simply be ignored with only internal logic being executed. To recap, RxJS provides a variety of ways to register your observer next, error, and complete functions while calling the subscribe method. In practice, I find myself more often than not supplying the next callback as the first function to subscribe and managing completion and error handling through operators, which we will learn about soon. If I do need to supply complete and error callbacks on the observer, I will generally use the observer object as I think it's a bit easier to read, especially for others reading your code who may not know about the function order for the subscribe method.